and we have significant numbers of bog bodies, bogs preserved in the acid peat of the bogs, many of them resulting from pagan, a loaded word, sacrifice. The absence of written records left those eager to promote a Celtic revival free to reject backwards, in a way, their own images and desires. The aspirant nation, Ireland became independent only in 1922, responded enthusiastically, adopting a panoply of gods and heroes. Patrick Pearse, one of the primary movers in the 1916 Easter Rising, which led a number of years later to independence, in effect invited one of those mythological heroes, Cuchulainn, to join him in the General Post Office, which was the locus of the Rising, thus ensuring the line of succession and legitimacy. The Rising is commemorated today by a statue of the dying Cuchulainn in the GPO. As the centenary of that Rising falls next year, a thorough self-examination by Irish society has begun. What Ireland sees in the mirror is a vibrant society, more inclusive and accepting of diversity than perhaps it was in the past. We Irish are, of course, and we would be the first to admit it, in many respects still a work in progress. I want now to turn briefly to areas of linguistic and cultural influence. Cyprus and Greece, Austria and Germany, Belgium and its neighbours, all are pairings where there is a shared language. Often, cultural figures from the smaller entity are able to grow to fill the wider stage. There is an osmosis between the two entities. Ireland too fits this paradigm with one important difference. We used to have a separate language, Celtic or Gaelic or the Irish language. And Marshall McLuhan's dictum on the medium being the message, or even the massage, the way it molds perceptions and reactions, is relevant in teasing out the repercussions of linguistic alienation. Yeats and his collaborators in the Celtic revival, as we will hear, tried to make good this debilitating shortfall, albeit by concentrating more on the cultural than the purely linguistic. A little historical background. Ireland, like Cyprus, was subjected to successive waves of invasion, turning the island into a palimpsest of archaeological and cultural remains. Leaving aside the Vikings, who were active in Ireland a millennium ago, and whose influence was indeed significant, our current history may be said to have begun in 1169, when the Anglo-Normans came to stay. Over the years, these intermarried and adopted local customs, costumes, mores, and language, becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves. This going native was a source of concern in London, leading eventually to a determination to extirpate the Gaelic identity. In part, this was achieved through what was called plantation, where English and Scottish entrepreneurs or planters were encouraged to take over land dispossessed from the local owners. Many of the native Irish were consigned, in the words of Oliver Cromwell, to hell or to Connaught. Connaught being the impoverished west of Ireland, where the last surviving native speakers of Irish remain to this day. The Great Hunger, as the famines of the 1840s due to the potato blight are collectively known, was the definitive death knell for Gaelic as a national language. Apart from the impact of the mortality rate, many survivors had to emigrate to countries where English would be more useful for survival than their native tongue. Some of this territory in the west of Ireland is where Yeats spent much of his childhood. It features prominently in his poetry, to the extent it has become known as Yeats country. Names like Innisfree, the Rosses, Dencar, Drumcliff, and of course Knocknarea and Benbulben resonate in his work. And there are samples, books in English and Greek on Yeats's work here, if people are interested afterwards. Professor Barry will now set the context for this season of memory and reflection, drawing on Yeats's role in developing our foundational narrative. Indeed, Yeats himself alluded to this role when he accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923, stating that it was as much recognition for the new Irish Free State, as it was called then, as for him personally. Kevin is an emeritus professor of University College Galway, the capital of the west of Ireland, and thus ideally placed to give us his perspective on Yeats and the Ireland he helped to create. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Nicholas Twist and to his wife Patricia for offering myself and my wife Aoife hospitality while we're visiting Cyprus, and thanks to the Soloneion bookshop for providing this venue. And I think it's not that the bookshop could be a celebratory place for a lecture, but it's for me a celebratory thing to be in a bookshop as rich as this and to be asked to give a talk. So thanks to everybody and thanks to all of you for coming. I'll be talking for approximately 40 minutes. The lecture, W.B. Yeats at 150, Collective Memory, Ancient Pasts, is divided into 4 sections: Commemorations, Writing and Mapping, Display, and a closing brief section on migrants. So let's begin with Commemorations. It's 100 years since the death of 50,000 Irish soldiers in the British Army during World War I. And next year it'll be 100 years since the proclamation of an Irish Republic by a handful of rebels outside the General Post Office on Dublin's main thoroughfare, O'Connell Street. The Rising in Easter week 1916 subsequently became the foundation narrative of the Irish state. Its leaders, traitors to the British, were summarily executed under martial law. A permanent memorial will be unveiled in 2016 at the General Post Office. Beneath its portico, the Republic was declared, and the GPO, as the Irish call it, is the primary lieu de mémoire of the modern Irish state. The early 20th century was for Ireland a turning point in the story of its independence. Following the signing of a treaty with Great Britain, the Irish Free State was established in 1922. It was immediately a divided island. Civil war broke out between those who supported and those who opposed the treaty. Among the many tragedies of the Civil War was the loss to Irish collective memory of direct knowledge about medieval and pre-modern Ireland. The opposing forces blew to ashes the Public Records Office, and the particles of that explosion hung in the air, still hang in the air. The island of Ireland was divided in 1921 by a border between north and south, each with its capital city, Belfast in the north, Dublin for the south. Most of the province of Ulster remains today a part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So, commemorations. It's 150 years since the birthday of W.B. Yeats, acknowledged as the greatest of Irish poets, both by those who support and those who oppose his politics. Yeats's poems chronicled decisive national events: Easter 1916, Meditations in Time of Civil War. And take the concluding salvos of each of those poems. Easter 1916, I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and MacBride, and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, where evergreen is worn, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. And then with more variety of rhythm, but no less declarative, Meditations in time of Civil War, we had fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair, more substance in our enmities than in our love. O honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. Yeats's accented rhythms, like those of popular ballads, like those of magic spells, deliberately drive names, events, and judgments into the public mind. Less than a year after the achievement of Irish statehood, Yeats, as Ireland's national poet, received the 1923 Nobel Prize for Literature. And in the words of the Nobel jury, the prize was awarded for his always inspired poetry, which is a highly artistic form, gives expression to the spirit of a whole nation. That phrase hangs in the air, whole nation. Yeats himself asserted that the link between his work and the New Ireland was direct and violent. As early as 1902, he had staged an allegory of blood sacrifice, the story of a woman who recovers her youth and beauty only when men die for her. And the title of this play, Kathleen Ní Húlahán, Yeats asked of himself, did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? Wondering aloud, knowing full well that the answer was yes, it did. Yeats's theatre, the Abbey, subsidised by the new state, was his chief weapon in popularising his version of the Irish literary revival. In recognition of his role as public intellectual, the government appointed him senator. He took his seat in the upper house of the new Irish Parliament, and from that perch, no less than in his poetry and plays, he berated the new state for, as he saw it, its Catholic middle-class morality and its popular democratic squalor. As he declared in the 1930s, when I stand upon O'Connell Bridge in the half-light and notice the discordant architecture, all those electric signs where modern heterogeneity has taken physical form, a vague hatred comes up out of my own dark, and I am certain that wherever in Europe there are minds strong enough, in 4 or 5 or less generations, that hatred will have issued in violence and imposed some kind of rule of kindred. I cannot know the nature of that rule, for its opposite fills the light. All I can do to bring it nearer is to intensify my hatred. Now, I would argue that it's to intensify hatred that of the present that Yeats turned to ancient pasts. Gaelic, Byzantine and Greek, Japanese and Indian. From the Gaelic he fashioned plays and poems about the deaths of Irish epic heroes, in particular the death of Cuchulainn. On extended visits to Italy, he collected large format photographs of Byzantine church mosaics from Ravenna to Palermo, and declared that it was in the Palatine Chapel at Palermo that he found the image he was looking for, Christ, as he put it, with the face of pitiless intellect. From Japan, he took the ritualistic forms of no theatre. From India, the poetics of theosophy and myths of reincarnation. And from the ancient Greek, he took images of the outcast, even unto death, and translated Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Colonus. A phrasing from that, endure what life God gives, and ask no longer span, cease to remember the delights of youth, travel wearied, aged man, delight becomes death longing, if all longing else be vain. Yeats had no Greek, and Yeats had no Irish. He asked for assistance in Greek from his friend Oliver St. John Gogarty, a passionate Hellenist and fellow senator. Gogarty chanted Sophocles aloud so that Yeats might capture the music of the Greek. Now we'll meet Gogarty again shortly under the name that, to his enormous irritation, made him infamous, stately, plump Buck Mulligan in James Joyce's Ulysses. And Buck Mulligan, an unreliable friend, urges Stephen Dedalus, you remember, if you and I could only work together, we might do something for this island, Hellenize it. And the original dust jacket for Ulysses was indeed Hellenic. Its exact shade of blue, carefully sourced by Joyce in Paris, white letters on a blue field, an Irish epic with a Roman title wrapped in a Greek flag. The Iliad, as I understand it, was written down in the 8th century before our era. And Lycurgus gave instructions that Sophocles' plays be committed to writing in the 4th century. Fast forward from that date, Lycurgus's date, some 1,000 years, and travel from the eastern to the western edge of Europe, there is no evidence of written texts in Ireland before the arrival of Christianity. And Christianity arrived late in Ireland, towards the middle of the 5th century. Before that date, everything Irish is prehistory. The Irish language borrowed from Latin its key words for literacy: scrivum, scribo, liam, lego, piaum, penna, litir, litera. And in the same manner as the Goths adapted Greek letter forms to create the Gothic alphabet and the Slavs Cyrillic, so too the Irish alphabet is a conversion of Latin letters to record the distinctive sounds of Old Irish. All textual sources from the pre-Christian Irish past, the annals, the origin myths, the epic tales, the cattle raids, the deaths of heroes, all were written, or we might better say were written down, by Christian scribes within a biblical frame. For example, the Book of Invasions describes Scythian ancestors, migrations from the Egypt of Moses, goddesses descended from Noah, making their way westward to take Irish husbands. The outstanding epic of ancient Ireland, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, or cattle raid violence and nobility. Yet according to the Gaelic scholar David Green, the Táin Bó Cúailnge was constructed as a retrospective epic. In his words, a conscious attempt to provide Ireland with an epic comparable to the Aeneid. A monastic scribe, when he had finished writing out a version of the Táin Bó Cúailnge in Irish, added below the text a personal note in his more native Latin: "But I, who have written this history, or rather fable, am doubtful about many things in this history or fable, for some of them are the figments of demons, some of them poetic imaginings, some true, some not, some for the delight of fools." So it's an irony of history that the pagan Irish past was transmitted to Irish readers since the 5th century by the very culture, Christianity, that largely destroyed it. And furthermore, since the 18th century, when the old Irish stories first became of interest to antiquarians and people of literature, almost all Irish readers came to these Gaelic texts in English translation. So once again, the remnants of the ancient civilization are transmitted to us by means of nationality must find its basic reason for being in something that surpasses changeable entities such as blood or human speech. Cultural revivalists such as the young Yeats, who sought direct access to an ancient Irish past, free of foreign influence, preferred the Irish landscape to translated written texts. Mapping appeared to offer a more intimate, a more reliable access to the Irish past. The topography of place names, the wildness of the Atlantic rim, the apparent emptiness of the landscape, the traces of ancient earthworks and ruined palaces, these constituted a kind of ur-text of Irishness. Map-making had a special importance in the construction of this kind of collective memory. And none is more influential than the map-making project of the Irish Ordnance Survey. In this, it's difficult to read. You see a headland in the west of Ireland. It's marked with its lighthouse, but it's also marked as the island off the shore being the bed of the lovers Diarmuid and Gráinne from Irish myth. The gap between land and island is Cuchulain's Leap. And this mapping project that ran under the direction of Westminster from 1824 to 1842 brought together an unparalleled group of Irish scholars. The mapping included the collation of county books, immersed in local lore of place names, linked to the distinctive objects visible in the landscape. Here, the hill of Knocknarea in Sligo with the tomb of Queen Maeve marked upon it. And the preeminent European scholar of national memory, Joop Leersen, has this to say about the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. It was, he says, a major contribution to the cultural nationalism of later decades, in that it equated the very land itself with the Gaelic past and the Gaelic-speaking peasantry, thus canonising the Gaelic tradition as the very bedrock, the cultural ground under the feet of modern Ireland. making Gaelic culture literally aboriginal and autochthonous to Ireland, a native fruit of its very soil. The Ordnance Survey, Learson concludes, turned the entire countryside of Ireland into one vast lieu de mémoire. So the colonising project of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland is an extreme example of the law of unintended consequences. A military mapping of the countryside turns into a nationalist text. And it rebounded most against Westminster when the popular Irish nationalist leader of the 19th century, Daniel O'Connell, exploited landscape as collective memory. His Association for the Repeal of the Act of Union between Great Britain and Ireland organised mass meetings at the Hill of Tara, the chief seat of the ancient Irish kings and of Queen Maeve, and at Clontarf, where one of the greatest of those kings, Brian Boru, in 1014, was reputed to have driven the Vikings out of Ireland. So it's as a pilgrim following the path of 19th century Irish nationalists that Yeats exploited rural landscape as site of memory. He imagined a Sligo almost uninhabited, but full of ancient heroic markers and place names. The wind has bundled up the clouds high over Knocknarea and thrown the thunder on the stones for all that Maeve can say. Angers that are like noisy clouds have set our hearts beat, but we have all bent low and kissed the quiet feet of Kathleen, the daughter of Houlihan. So powerful are Yeats's evocations of landscape that many readers have thought him to be a child of County Sligo. But in fact, he was born in Dublin, grew up in the Dublin suburbs, and in England. Yeats had to fight for this virtual control of Ireland's ancient landscape, and sometimes against some very strange intruders. From 1899 to 1902, a group that called themselves the British Israelites arrived at Tara to dig up the hill to discover the Ark of the Covenant. They wanted to prove once and for all the Britishness of Ireland. Yeats, playing a kind of Indiana Jones role, fired off a letter to the Times of London. We saw them digging and shoveling without any supervision, hopelessly mixing the different layers of earth. All we can do under the circumstances is to draw the attention of the public to this desecration. Tara is probably the most consecrated spot in Ireland, says Yeats to the readership of the Times. Its destruction will leave many bitter memories behind it. Section 3, there's Tara and Tara, and section 3. Display. In addition to a topography that remained largely undisturbed, or apparently so, the Irish nationalist of the 19th century had one further mode of access to an apparently unmediated past: the treasury of ancient gold, iron and bronze in the possession of the Royal Irish Academy. When the charismatic young Danish archaeologist Jens Jacob Worsay arrived in Ireland in 1846, he commissioned enormous sheets of drawings of this material culture as a record of these antiquities to lodge in the National Museum, the National Danish Museum. Similar to what was in place in London's South Kensington, the National Gallery, the Museum of Natural History, the National Library and National Museum. Under the new dispensation, the museum was to display the treasury of ancient Irish material culture acquired from the Royal Irish Academy. The decorative iconography chosen for the new museum and the arrangement of its displays may therefore come as a surprise, because the floor beneath the Great Rotunda is composed of signs of the zodiac. In the central floor, the mosaics are of Hermes and Orpheus, of Eurydice and Cleopatra. From the day the museum opened its doors, visitors entering the building discovered Sikh field guns from the Indian Mutiny, as well as casts of Greco-Roman statues. Contemporary photographs of the display allow us to make out in the first circle the Praxiteles Venus of Cnidos, against the wall the Venus Callipyge. Passing through the central court, the visitor then encountered a medley that included an Irish high cross, some more classical sculptures, a piece of French Romanesque church architecture, and in pride of place, the heroic statue of Lieutenant Walter Richard Pollock Hamilton, painted bronze, defending to the death the British ambassador's residence at Kabul. A fierce Afghani falls below him, and in the background, without any concern for what's going on, Venus is letting down her hair, and in the foreground, a Buddha is reclining at ease. The New York Times was not impressed. Under the headline, Dublin's new art museum, South Kensington Methods Seen in Ireland, the paper complained, the main space on the ground floor is filled with specimens of the art of various nations, not excluding Mexico and Central America, Burmese idols, Hindu gods, Japanese and Chinese curios. Of 10 rooms on the ground floor, 1 is assigned to Ireland. Of 10 on the second floor, 2 are set aside for the collection of the Royal Irish Academy. Arthur Evans of the Ashmolean at Oxford and of some fame at Knossos summed it up: the grossest collection of rubbish that ever disgraced a national museum. But the display proved hugely popular. Dubliners loved it. The museum was so busy that it can be counted alongside Vaudeville Theatre and motor car races as a key Dublin venue for popular culture. Admission ran as high as 1,500 entries a day, and James Joyce's Ulysses, set so few years after its opening, confirms how popular the museum was. Joyce also tells us why. The government planned to find other popular opportunities to harness collective memory to an Irish ancient past, and it turned its eyes to sport. The Olympic Games in Paris in 1924 revived a notion in Ireland of a celebration of national character and reconciliation after civil war. The state decided to restage Ireland's equivalent to the Olympics, the Tailteann Games. The Games, it was proclaimed, took their name from the ancient Queen Tailteann and was celebrated beside the hill of Tara thousands of years before the Greeks came up with the Olympics, and flourished until the arrival of the hated English. In the words of the chief organizer of the Games, they would celebrate racial pride, national outlook, love of the homeland. The festival was scheduled to begin immediately after the Paris Olympics and before the British Empire Games, late August 1924. The Dublin Horse Show would be on at the same time, large crowds anticipated, all social classes taking part. And the range of sporting competitions included motor racing, billiards, tennis and hurling, and were to be more extensive for young boys. Over the door he had written a quotation from the Táin Bó Cúailnge, where Culcullen declares, "I care not though I live but one day and one night, if only my name and deeds live after me." And so all these elements came together when the Irish state chose Oliver Shepherd's statue of the death of Cuchulainn for the key lieu de mémoire of the new Irish nation, Dublin's General Post Office, site of that 1916 proclamation of a republic that had been wrecked by shelling during the week-long rising. Eamon de Valera, as Prime Minister of Ireland, unveiled this statue at the rebuilt GPO on Easter Sunday 1935, declaring that it symbolised the dauntless courage and abiding constancy of our people. Persistent internal civil wars bring us to face with the fragility of this emblem of a collective memory. For the same emblem appears at the other end of the political spectrum. Here we see it, De Valera choosing the statue of Cuchulainn for the GPO. When he chose it, the political opposition of the day were quick to point out that Cuchulainn never drove out foreigners. He was the heroic defender of Ulster against the southern provinces, and he, to quote a parliamentary member, fought only Irishmen. On a gable wall in Belfast, Cuchulainn stands guard today for unionist Ulster against those nationalists who seek to extend an independent Irish republic north of the border. So a concluding section on migrants. The Belfast poet Derek Mahon, who now lives in Kinsale, County Cork, which about is as far south as the island allows him, makes visible an Irish population north and south of the border that has been remembered out of existence, migrants. Some 3 out of every 4 people born on the island of Ireland in the 30s and 40s chose to leave. The Irish landscape is littered with their traces. In a poem entitled A Garage in County Cork, Mahon goes back not to ancient epic, but to Ovid's Metamorphoses to give those emigrants dignity. A poem which he describes as his most Yeatsian poem was inspired by a postcard of abandoned petrol pumps. Their hoses entwined brought the chief emblem of the poem. Mahon invites the reader back to the place itself, a wreck in the middle of nowhere. The poem, surely you paused at this roadside oasis in your nomadic youth and saw the mound of never-used cement. Where did they go? South Boston? Cricklewood? Somebody somewhere thinks of this as home. Ovid's tale of Baucis and Philomen, poor peasants rewarded for their hospitality to a nomadic god by becoming in death a pair of intertwining trees, gave Mahon the linkage he sought between what's gone and what remains, between the closeness of rubbish to things of value. A god who spent the night here once rewarded natural courtesy with eternal life, changing to petrol pumps, that they be spared forever there, an old man and his wife. On the Irish national holiday, St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March, the President of Ireland offers best wishes to compatriots at home and abroad. And this year, on that day, President Michael D. Higgins said, "Today is a day when we come together to celebrate and share our rich culture and heritage. It's also the day when we reflect on the life of St. Patrick, our patron saint, a migrant who arrived on our shores some 1,600 years ago. It's a story that has been relived time and again by many Irish people across the centuries. It's an experience we share with so many migrant peoples across the world, a reminder of how the theme of migration lies at the heart of our country's identity. It's all a history of comings and goings. The hero of James Joyce's Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, is a Hungarian Jew, a first-generation immigrant to Dublin. The novel's author was himself a serial immigrant. Joyce's epigraph to Ulysses reads, Trieste, Zurich, Paris, 1914-1921. In Paris, Samuel Beckett translated his own works from English to French, from French to English. On London's Fleet Street, Yeats paused before a shop window that displayed a toy fountain, and remembering the noise of falling water in his mother's native Sligo, sat down to write The Lake Isle of Innisfree. Reading about another toy, the mechanical bird of an emperor, Theophilus, Yeats sailed to Byzantium and imagined himself singing with the throat of a golden bird. Of the protagonists in this talk, Gogarty lived the last decades of his life in the United States. He died in New York. Joyce in Switzerland. Yeats near Menton on the French Mediterranean. And Stephen McKenna, who refused the medal for his translation of Plotinus, exiled himself to England and died in Cornwall. So the dream of the nationalists, by way of conclusion, that the Irish people of a single origin with a unique destiny and homeland was a false hope. The mistake nationalists made was their failure to appreciate that our culture is a mixed bag. Back there in the early Middle Ages, the Book of Invasions was right. On the evidence of that book, it was migrants that built everything that still stands above ground, from Newgrange to the round towers, to the high crosses, to the disused petrol pumps. As an island culture, like so many others, the very topography of Ireland is encoded with the traces of nomadic peoples. The ancient Irish past was written down in Christian monasteries, as we said. Its Gaelic heroes act out their fate in words that come from Mediterranean shores. They're warmed by the climates of the Orient. The ancient Irish kings, and I quote, "go to war equipped with tents and pavilions. Women have lips as red as Parthian leather, and a man can have teeth as yellow as a camel's." There being no camels in Ireland. The extraordinary achievement of William Butler Yeats is that his strongest poems hold in a single thought the nomadic and the fixed. He is the poet of an island people with a collective memory that is heterogeneous and unstable. His finest work is a concentration, a voyage out and back, an invasion of ancient pasts, Greek, Japan, India, Ireland, and as in one of his greatest poems, Byzantium, a straddle on the dolphin's mire and blood, spirit after spirit, the smithies break the flood, the golden smithies of the emperor, marble of the dancing floor, break, bitter furies of complexity, those images that yet, fresh images beget that dolphin torrent, that gone tormented sea. Thank you.